Thank you. Thank you, Costa and Greg, for organizing this great event. I thought I'd say a few words before I begin my talk, but I have to tell you I'm terrible at speeches, so John, please bear with me as I lean on a script that I've prepared. It's a real honor to be part of today's festivities, for John has had an enormous impact on both my professional career and my personal life. He's not only become one of my closest colleagues, but he's become a great friend as well. It began for me in 1991 when I came to U of T as a research associate to work with John on the Playbot project. John was a wonderful mentor and supervisor, giving me the freedom to pursue a wide berth of research projects, the freedom to work with his outstanding students, and the freedom to travel extensively, not only to conferences, but to establish collaborations with some top research groups around the world. And Henrik is one of the people I got to know personally on one of those trips. I look back at this period as one of the most productive, most enjoyable stages in my career, and I have John to thank for the environment he created and the support he provided. But John's generosity as a mentor and supervisor was not only reflected in how he treated me, but how he treated my family. He also hired my wife Suzanne to bring her language expertise to the Playbot project, which enabled us all to collaborate together. But it also meant we could both pursue our careers in Toronto and stay here longer. John's support made a huge difference in our lives and helped bring our two families together, including our kids, in what would become a lifelong family friendship. John's mentorship and support did not end with my position. When Suzanne was being recruited by the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science in '94, John contacted Zenon Polishin, the director of the center, encouraging them to consider me as well. His endorsement, I'm sure, was critical in my getting an offer there, and we went to Rutgers in 1994. Each year, while we were at Rutgers, we'd come back to Toronto to see family and friends on holidays. I fondly remember John and Patty taking us to holiday musicals each Christmas. And over these years, our friendship grew. I've watched Leah and Constantine grow up, just as John and Patty have watched our son Kiva grow up. In 1998, when the ATOP program was announced, a program that translated to 30-plus faculty lines at each Ontario university, it was John who encouraged Suzanne and I to come back to Toronto and throw our hats in the ring, telling us that if we ever wanted to come back home, now was our chance. There's not a day that goes by that Suzanne and I don't pinch ourselves and feel incredibly lucky to be back in Toronto, back with friends and family, back with wonderful colleagues, and back in a country whose values we resonate with. We're forever grateful to John for the huge role that he played in that. When I was a graduate student, I was part of a lab that valued interdisciplinary research spanning human and computer vision. One of the things I most valued about the computer vision group at U of T was the interdisciplinary work that John and Alan were doing along this same front. John has established himself as a world authority in visual attention, and his research is a shining example of how computational modeling can be used to understand human vision and how human vision can inspire computer vision. Truly interdisciplinary human-computer vision researchers like John are a rare breed, and I greatly admire how he's mastered two fields and the commitments he has made to two communities. As a tribute to John's exemplary interdisciplinary research, I'm going to take a few minutes to describe our own recent foray into human vision. It involves John Wilder, my postdoc, who was a catalyst who helped make this journey possible, and he was also an ex-York postdoc. Alan Jepson, one of John's closest computer vision colleagues at U of T, and another exceptional mentor of mine. Dirk Bernhard Walter, I think he's here as well, a U of T psychology faculty member and an ex-postdoc of John's, and Kaleem Siddiqui, a close friend and colleague of mine from McGill, and an ex-postdoc of one of John's own mentors, Steve Zucker, who I think is either here or coming later today. And Kaleem's student Mortaza. The connections of this team to John are truly remarkable. So I'd like to now present some of that work to you. So Dirk Bernhard Walter started working some time ago on the project, on the research addressing the problem of human scene perception and categorization. And he created these data sets of 6 possible scene categories: beaches, buildings, forests, highways, industry, and mountains. And he ran experiments with human subjects and found that human subjects can categorize these scenes incredibly quickly, under 45 milliseconds, in some cases as quickly as 11 milliseconds. And furthermore, certain downstream regions in the visual pathway seem to be primarily responsible for this scene perception. And really the question is, what information is being encoded in these photographs that allows humans to categorize the scene so effortlessly and so quickly? Dirk followed that experiment up with another experiment where he hired professional human artists to trace out the boundaries on the original color photographs. Here's an example of one of the mountain scenes. Here's one of the line drawings. And when he applied the same experiment using the line drawing data, the performance was almost equally well. And in fact, if you reduce the stimulus time, the two begin to converge in terms of performance as a function of time. So somehow, stripping out all the appearance and texture and color from the scene, we're still able to categorize these scenes using just the pure shape information. And that's something that we're trying to better understand. So what Dirk did is analyze the human artist line drawings, which were all decomposed into piecewise linear line segments. And he computed features on these distributions of line segments, including an orientation distribution, a length distribution, curvature, where curvature was simply the angle between adjacent linear segments because it was a linear approximation, junction type, and junction angle. And then he trained SVM classifiers on these features to try to predict or categorize the scene given the input line drawings. And he correlated the errors that the humans made with the errors that the SVM classifiers made. And he found that there was very poor correlation based on the unary features of orientation and length, but much better correlation based on the binary features of curvature, junction type, and junction angle. And as someone who's very interested in perceptual grouping and non-accidental features, it wasn't surprising to us that it's the relations among the contours that carry such discriminatory and important information. So in an effort to try to drill down and better understand what these binary relationships might be between these features, we set up our first experiment. So for each of the line drawings, we generated two stimuli, each containing exactly 50% of the original black pixels. In one case, we either removed the junctions, and in the other case, we removed the middle segments. And we maintain the spatial locations of all the segments, so we don't do any reorientation of the lines or shifting of the lines. And just to give you a very simple example, illustrative example, here's the original intact line drawing. Here's removing the junctions, where we simply take every line, we divide it into 4 equal chunks of 25%, and in this case we remove the outer two 25% chunks, and in the other case we remove the contiguous inner 50% of the line. So as an example of the figure I showed at the beginning, here's our intact line drawing. Here's the line drawing after removing 50% corresponding to the outer ends of each line, which is where the junctions are, and here's the result of removing the middle 50% of each line. As I flip back and forth, I wonder if you find any of these scenes easier to categorize than the other. So it turns out that removing the middle parts of the segments decreased performance in human subjects. And why might that be? Well, one hypothesis is that trying to understand the scene requires extracting the surfaces and their relations to recover the 3D structure of the scene. And in our line drawings, what is a surface but a closure, a contour closure in the image? And removing 50% of the contours really disrupts these closures. And in fact, removing the middle segments removes the non-accidental symmetry relations, which perhaps assist in finding those closures. So why symmetry? Symmetry, in fact, is something that I've been very interested in much of my career. We see lots of examples of symmetry in nature. Here's sort of mirror symmetry of the sides of the wings of the bird. Similar mirror symmetry across the face and body of the elephant. We have rotational symmetry here, the petals of the flower. We have rotation and dilational symmetry here on this succulent plant. We have, again, a mirror symmetry here with the rainbow. And despite these examples, which tend to be sort of more globally symmetry-oriented, in fact, local symmetry is much more ubiquitous in nature. So, for example, although we may have a nice mirror axis of reflective global symmetry on the human on the left. In fact, once you start articulating the human, that global symmetry disappears. However, it's the local symmetry that survives the kind of articulation and changes in viewpoint. So really, the local symmetry is far more ubiquitous than global symmetry. So how can we explore the symmetry hypothesis with respect to our experiment where we delete 50% of the pixels in each case, focusing on that symmetry property? Well, if you remember, in the previous experiment, there really was no notion of symmetry. We simply treated each isolated line and deleted either the outer 50% or the middle 50%. There was no relational information really at all. So what we need now is some kind of symmetry score for our pixels that reflects the extent to which a pixel participates in a non-accidental symmetry relation with some other pixel in the image. And if we can do that, then we can score all the pixels in our line drawing and perform the same kind of sorting. The top 50% of the symmetry scoring pixels constitutes one stimulus. The other 50, the bottom 50% constitutes the other stimulus. So how do we compute our symmetry score? And to this, we draw on the work of Kaleem Siddiqui, one of the collaborators on the project, who, along with Steve Zucker and others, have long worked on the problem of medial axis-based representations. And just to remind you, for those of you not familiar, the medial axis transform of a 2D shape is the locus of centers of these maximally inscribed disks that sweep out the boundary of the shape. So the thing to note about it is each of these medial points has an XY position and a radius, where the circle or the disk is tangent to both sides. And we can also, to note, from a given point, we can figure out where the maximally inscribed disk touches the two boundaries. And similarly, if we know for a given point on the contour, we can figure out the center of the medial disk that touches that, that's tangent to that point. So a simple mechanism for scoring the symmetry that we worked on. If these are two contours in the image, C1 and C2, we take a point P. Remember, we want to assign a symmetry score to point P. We have a medial axis that we can compute here, which you see in blue. And from our point P, we can figure out the center of the maximally inscribed disk that touches point P. Let's call that Q naught. We're going to define a window of skeleton points on either side of Q naught. In this case, we have 3 points on either side. And all we're going to do now is simply compare the radii of adjacent maximally inscribed disks as we step from one end to the window to the other. And our scoring function is simply the proportion of these differences in radii that are below some threshold, or the number of radii, or the number of adjacencies that approximate parallelism with respect to some parameter tau, and that's normalized by the size of the window. Now, the problem is, you guessed that this was the outer boundaries of the shape, and this was somehow the inside of the shape, and I drew the medial axis, which is the correct medial axis. But of course, the algorithm doesn't know which is figure and which is ground. This could be ground on the other side, and this could be figure on, this could be figure on the other side, and figure on this side, and this could be a gap. So when we compute our medial axis, we don't know what is figure versus ground, which means that we have other medial axes on the other side. And furthermore, there exists some point T naught on the other medial axis, which is also tangent to that same point P. So how do we resolve these competing scores, one coming from each side of the contour at P? We simply choose the maximum of the scores, the maximum of the score at T naught versus the maximum of the score at Q. And you recall how we can map the scores from the centers of the disk back to the contours. So now we have our score for each point on the contour. And if we go back to our original scene here, here's the color photograph. Here's the artist's line drawing. Here's the distance transform. So this is the algorithm by which Kaleem and Mortaza compute the medial axis transform for a line drawing. By the way, these are open contours. They don't have to be closed contours. They can be closed contours. Here's the average outward flux, which is an analysis over a small region around a point based on the gradient of the distance transform. And when you threshold the outward flux, you get these medial points. And they've been color-coded here according to connected components in the image. So Each of these colors represents a connected component medial axis transform of some region in the image. And remember now that we compute the scores for each of these points. We migrate these scores to the boundaries where the maximally inscribed disk is tangent, and each point will have contributions of score from one side and the other, and we choose the max in each case, and we get our scores. So here is our symmetry score, scored from high to low of our original contours. You recall the next step is to sort them according to score and define two stimuli now, each containing precisely 50% of the original contour pixels, the 50% with the highest symmetry score, the 50% with the lowest symmetry score. So here you see on the left the 50% with the most symmetric 50% and the least symmetric 50%. Which one looks better? The one on the left. So just to give you some anecdotal examples, here is one of the beach scenes. This is the fully intact scene from the artist. This is the symmetry on, the highest 50%. Back to the intact scene. This is the symmetry off, the lowest 50%. Here's one of the city scenes, fully intact, symmetry on, symmetry off. So what we do in the experiment is we expose them, we train them on fully intact scenes only. We don't train them on the perturbed scenes. We train them on fully intact scenes. We start with a low training, with a long stimulus time, and we ramp them up down to about 33 milliseconds, and then we bump it back up at test time to 53 milliseconds, which is the time that they can achieve about a 70% performance rate on fully intact scenes. And then we test them at these 53% on a mixture of intact and perturbed scenes. And we show them the scene. Then we show them a mask, a jumbled mask, which kind of flushes the visual pathway. And then it's blank until they respond with one of the 6 keystrokes according to the 6 categories. And then we repeat for 360 trials. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, so here's the example training sequence. So you fixate on the cursor, then the mask. You hit a response. At training time, if you hit the wrong response, you get feedback. At test time, you don't. It's a mountain scene. I think we have one from each category here. Okay, and here's the example test week sequence. You'll see it's quite difficult. Yes. No stimulus is used once. Sorry, no, more than once. No stimulus used in training time is used at testing time as well. And we mix into the testing some fully intact scenes. I asked Dirk, why do we do that? And he said, got to lift their spirits some because it's such a hard task. I can't imagine doing 360 trials of this. Okay. So here was the results, which were even more significant than the previous results, where we were just deleting unary 50% portions of the segments, either the outer two or the inner two. And now we're trying to encode some relational information between different segments. One of the exciting things about this work is that there's all these different modifications of the scoring function that we're trying to explore to see how they play out with respect to the human subjects, to try to get a glimpse of what they might respond to more or less. And that's some of the current work that we're doing. So just to give you an idea of some of the things we're looking at, in fact, there's a brand new fMRI scanner in the Department of Psychology at U of T, and Dirk and John are now conducting fMRI studies, which with very few subjects so far seem to suggest that perhaps these areas V3, lateral occipital complex, retrosplenial context, PPA, and FA play some kind of role in processing symmetry. So again, he's training these SVM classifiers on these separate regions of activation in the brain. In fact, John is on his way to VSS and ModVis to present work where we're exploring tapered ribbons, not just sort of parallel ribbons, and early results seem to suggest at least the same effect holds for tapered ribbons. That might suggest that symmetry is taper invariant. That would be understandable because constant sweep cross sections or symmetry in the world, if it's not viewed frontal parallelly, it's going to appear as some kind of tapered projection in the image. So we're drilling down to try to better understand that. Of course, all of this is applied to entire scenes, and one of the questions that we'd like to ask is to go back and visit some of the results, for example, Biederman's results on individual objects, where he proposed that it was really the junctions between the parts and not the middle segments of the parts which were more important. And in fact, our findings suggest that maybe that's not the case. So we'd like to go back and see, is the same phenomenon hold in single object recognition, where you don't have a lot of scene clutter and difficulty to identify figure from background. Perhaps the symmetry plays a different role once you've done the figure ground segmentation. So that's something that we'd like to do as well. And at the end of the day, we'd also like to figure out how can we use this information about symmetry in some kind of deep learning framework. How can we guide the learning of a CNN, for example, using this symmetry information? And there's some early work by Alan Yule and Zhang Bai and people called Deep Skeleton, where they've been able to train using different radii, multi-scale skeletons, if you will, where each radius or each scale governs the learning through a side output channel of one particular layer in the network. And maybe using our symmetry, we can also see if we can train a deep network to and see if it performs similarly as our own stimuli. In other words, if we train it on intact scenes and test it on the perturbed scenes, does it show a difference between the symmetry on and the symmetry off? So that's something that we'd like to try as well. So just in closing, a few final words going back to my speech. So to wrap up, John, you've had a remarkable impact on two separate communities, provided outstanding leadership, built remarkable vision labs in 2 universities, and trained generations of successful students and postdocs. But what I admire just as much is the kindness and generosity with which you've conducted yourself throughout your entire career and the personal relationships you've invested in. I'm one of those lucky beneficiaries, and I'll be forever grateful for what you've done for me and my family. Congratulations on a truly spectacular career, John. It's an honor to celebrate today with you. Thank you.